Samaritan Pentateuch has a nonsensical, impossible reading with a double final name. Just a copy is there. It's called didography. They wrote the same thing twice. Okay, you get these kind of errors. Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint at Genesis 30:36 have between them, where the Masoretic text has between himself. And the context calls for a third person plural pronoun, them, since the antecedent is Laban's sons, plural, not Laban. Probably what happened here is a malformed final mem got split into a nun and a wow. And that's just, these things happen. There's a case where Masoretic text just has a copyist there. Okay, so these are simple things. That's one type of inadvertent copyist error. Genesis 9:6, Masoretic text. You have this thing that you're told, whoever sheds the blood of humans, by humans his blood will be shed. Septuagint has blood of humans in return for his blood, which resulted in an eye skip. From an eye skip, accidental omission of by humans. One of those by humans was skipped over. Okay. That's just what happened. You can tell it here. Now, the occurrences of these by tradition, Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint all have about equal numbers of these. It just happens. When people are copying things over, they make mistakes. If you've ever copied something over and made a mistake when you copied it over, right? It's anything you could have done, they did. Okay, it just is. Okay. And by the way, it's why you can't count the manuscripts and say, well, we have more manuscripts with this, it's a correct reading, because an error copied over 1 million times is still an error. Okay. Hey, now there's intentional changes to the text too. There's a number of different subcategories here. One is adjustment in the text to avoid confusion. This often involves anaphora. Anaphora are words that refer to other words. Think pronoun. That's the leading example of an anaphora. Okay. So Genesis 21:30, the Masoretic text was and who said. Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint read, and Abraham said. Since the previous speaker was Abimelech, a scribe supplied the subject to clarify it was Abraham's response, not Abimelech's words. Now, in context, it can't really be Abimelech's words. You can't mistake it, but some scribe wanted to make sure he didn't mistake it, so he intentionally put in what's the assumed antecedent. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, this is often what they do. When we write in English, we're told, don't use a pronoun unless you make its antecedent clear, right? That's how we're taught in English composition class. But the rule in the ancient Hebrew was just the opposite. It's, I'm going to write, I don't want necessarily make it clear, and if you're too stupid to figure out, that's your problem. Yeah. Okay. That's what's going on here. Okay. Intentional changes again, the same thing to avoid confusion. Masoretic text reads, and the Midianites sold him. Okay. And in Septuagint and Samaritan and Septuagint read, and the Midianites sold Joseph. Why did they change him to Joseph? Well, the last person mentioned was Jacob, and they didn't want you to think Jacob was sold. Now, again, you read the story, you probably wouldn't get it wrong. We read the story with him in there all the time. We know it's not Jacob. But it's very clearly an intentional change to make sure it's Joseph, not Jacob, that was sold. Now, again, notice many of these changes do not really change what the text says. Okay, the meaning of the text is no different. Now, we'll get to somewhere the meaning of the text is quite different. But in many of these changes to just clarify anaphora and other things, it's just clarifying what's already implied in the text. Okay. Intentional changes to the text. Adjustment in the text to avoid confusion. I couldn't find any in the Masoretic text. 16 times in the Samaritan Pentateuch, 52 times in the Septuagint. And almost all of these 16 in the Samaritan Pentateuch are also found in the Septuagint, which shows you how closely aligned they are again. Then there's intentional changes that are grammatical correction or adjustment to the text. So the Masoretic text in the Septuagint read the feeble, unimportant ones were, since the verb is singular, but the subject is plural. Samaritan Pentateuch adjusts the verb to a plural form. Just make verb and subject agree. Again, not a change that changes the meaning of the text at all. Samaritan Pentateuch in Genesis 3:5, and he lifted up his eyes. Masoretic text corrects the grammar by adding a direct object marker. So eyes, here's a direct object, but there's no direct object marker. Some scribe decided we need a direct object marker there. And it's not unusual for direct objects not to be marked by a direct object marker in Hebrew, even when they're definite. If you remember your Hebrew grammar, you only use that direct object marker for definite direct object. This is definite. His eyes, you direct, definite pair of eyes. But they added in. We can't tell what Septuagint is here because, of course, the Greek has no direct object marker. It has no way of really replicating that. But we can tell from the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's not like an I skip. In the Samaritan Pentateuch, there's nothing from your eyes to skip from this point to that point, similar things. So it's not that the Masoretic text had it and the Samaritan Pentateuch accidentally left it out. It's probably not a nice skip. Probably an intentional correction of grammar. Genesis 41:42, Masoretic text reads the gold chain. Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint read a gold chain. Now, no gold chain had been previously mentioned in the context of Genesis 41. So you wouldn't expect the gold chain because we haven't introduced one yet. You would expect a gold chain. Until you introduced it, then you would go the gold chain to refer back to it. So what the Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint do, they get rid of the article. Just that simple. Occurrences by tradition. Masoretic text seems to do this twice. Samaritan Pentateuch 17 times. Septuagint, once again, 48 times. Seeing a little bit of a trend here. Differences in the name of God. There are two places where the Samaritan Pentateuch disagrees with the Masoretic text in the Septuagint. It goes off on its own. Samaritan Pentateuch has God, whereas Masoretic text in the Septuagint in Genesis 20:18 read Kyrios or Yahweh, the word for Yahweh there. And then the other places, Samaritan Pentateuch has God Almighty, or God Most High, excuse me. Whereas Masoretic text reads Yahweh God Most High instead of God Most High. Septuagint has God, the highest one, God Most High. So there, again, a disagreement. Those are the only two places where the Samaritan Pentateuch disagrees with the others. However, the Septuagint does something quite different. Elsewhere, the Masoretic text in the Samaritan Pentateuch agree against the Septuagint, which says it's a different name for God. And this is really odd, and I have no explanation for it. This set of disagreements where the Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint will have, Samaritan Pentateuch and Masoretic text will have Yahweh and Septuagint will have God, or vice versa. This starts at Genesis 2:5 and it ends at Genesis 25:21, and then they agree before this and after this. What's going on in there? I have no idea.
Isn't that one of the reasons Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are said to be from different authors? One is the Yahweh Elohim.
Yeah, but it's not based on Septuagint. It's true that you have different ways to refer to God there in those two chapters.
Pretty consistent.
Yeah, again, with this, and this is of course the basis for the documentary hypothesis and so forth. And I always believe the documentary hypothesis would have never come about if they had more archaeological knowledge, because get into the 19th century, we start doing archaeology, we start digging up ancient Near Eastern texts with myths about their gods, and it's not uncommon for the pagan gods to be referred to by 3 or 4 different appellations, right? And had they known that, they wouldn't have taken that as a marker of different. But the documentary hypothesis arises before that knowledge came about.
So it would be wrong for me to think that Jose Altuve is kind of like William Shakespeare.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Shakespeare, people had his, try to split him up in different authors too. Yeah. But it's funny that, it arose before they knew that, oh, this is not uncommon in the ancient Near East at all.
Could you remind us of the documentary hypothesis?
This JEPP for sources supposedly for the Pentateuch. What I think it would have never come about had it come instead of have its roots in the 18th century, it would have had its roots in the late 19th century. It wouldn't have come about because people would have said, well, look at this is going on with different names for Baal or different names for Marduk or different, it's going on all over the place in ancient Near Eastern texts. Now, sometimes they harmonize phraseology between different passages. So in Genesis 1:6, Septuagint alone has the phrase, and it was so at the end of God's creative command, to match similar phrases at 1:9, 11, 15, and 24. Masoretic text and Samaritan Pentateuch do not have, and it was so, after Genesis 1:6. Apparently, somebody thought we need to be consistent here and move and put it back in Genesis 1:6 too. And God said, and it was so, right? Everywhere else in Genesis 1 it's there, so we'll put it in 1:6 too. So sometimes they intentionally change the text to harmonize. Genesis 23:1, Masoretic text and Samaritan Pentateuch at the end of the verse. These are the years of the life of Sarah. The absence of this phrase in Septuagint was not caused by paraplepsis. There's nothing for your eye to skip to there to leave out that phrase. So there's no such trigger for an eye skip. This is likely that the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text contain a purposeful harmonization of Sarah's death notice to the language used for the death notice of Abraham and Ishmael, which also had, these are the years of the life of Abraham. These are the years of the life of Ishmael. So it got added into the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch to harmonize with those passages. Okay. Genesis 24:55, Masoretic text and Septuagint read, interesting, days or 10, days about 10, days like 10, with meaning about 10 days. Samaritan Pentateuch, in contrast, has days or a month, which appears to be a harmonization to Numbers 9:22, which contains the only other occurrence of this type of phrase in the Pentateuch. So Samaritan Pentateuch probably just harmonized it. Maybe unconsciously, maybe the scribe who's writing it over has this in his subconscious somewhere from Numbers and just does it without even purposely thinking about it. Sometimes those things happen. Okay, Masoretic text of Samaritan Pentateuch, Genesis 33:1. We're going to get ready to reunite Jacob and Esau. reads Esau was coming. Septuagint reads Esau, his brother, was coming. To add in his brother, to harmonize it to 2730. And the harmonization injects this tense situation that was in 27. Remember, Esau wanted to kill Jacob, right? For taking the birthright, getting the blessing from his father. So by putting that his brother in, it adds a little more tension into this text where they're going to meet again when Jacob comes back to the land of Canaan. So this type of changes in the text. Masoretic text seems to have 13, Samaritan Pentateuch 102, Septuagint 224. Then there's intentional changes to alleviate a perceived logical difficulty in the text. And this is where we get to changes that make real changes in the text. So, Masoretic text, Genesis 2:2 reads, on the seventh day. Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint have on the sixth day. And Weaver's, who's written a lot on the text of the Septuagint of Genesis and was responsible for the getting in Septuagint volume on Genesis. He says this: since verse 1 clearly stated creation was completed on the sixth day, difficulty of the first clause in the Masoretic text, which kind of has God completing things on the seventh day, is obvious, and so they changed it to the sixth day so the reader wouldn't question when did God really end. So they intentionally changed the text there to the sixth day. Here's one very familiar to you, which you probably didn't realize. Genesis 2:24, and they will become one flesh, is what the Masoretic text reads. Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint read, and the two of them will become one flesh. Notice hoi duo, ace, beyond. The two of them become one flesh. Since this verse mentions four people, man, father, mother, wife, they added the two of them become one flesh, so you don't think all four become one flesh. And that's the way it's quoted in the New Testament. Now, it doesn't change the meaning at all. I mean, any reasonable reader is not going to think all four become one flesh. It doesn't change the meaning at all. And so, the New Testament feels free to quote the Septuagint that way.
This concept of intentional changes is a little troubling. Was that done by committee or one person?
Yes. It's troubling to us because we have this very high view of Scripture, right? And not that they didn't have a high view of Scripture, but at times they just thought they could help God out, I guess. And you find this all over the place in ancient texts. And even texts outside the Bible, if you do textual criticism on Suetonius or something like that, you can pick up the same thing. Well, I don't think Suetonius really meant to say that. And so a later scribe, they just didn't have the same attitude as we have. And yeah, it's very troubling from our perspective.
We always get told that they would die if they messed up.
The Masoretes in the Middle Ages, this is true. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, you get to Masoretes. All bets are off when you go back to antiquity. Yeah. So there you go. New Testament quotes Septuagints. And nothing wrong with it because it doesn't teach anything different. It's just one, again, they clarify something, perceived logical difficulty in the text. Okay. Genesis 35:22, after Reuben slept with Bilhah, you know that story. Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch report no reaction by Jacob. He finds out that his son, eldest son, slept with one of his wives. No reaction. The Septuagint thinks that's kind of strange. We need to do something. So they add something in the Septuagint. Okay, and it appeared evil to him. Okay, after Israel heard about it, right? So Jacob hears about it, and it appeared evil to him. This makes a lot more sense for the reader when you get to Genesis 49. The messianic promise doesn't go to the oldest child, Reuben, right? Reuben's condemned. He went up onto my bed, he says in Genesis 49. So here again, the Septuagint adds a little phrase because logically it appears strange that Jacob didn't do anything. Septuagint omits at the end of the verse in the Samaritan Pentateuch these words: "For the famine was severe in the land of Egypt." This could appear to be redundant because it's already been said at the beginning of 4157 and again at the end of 4158. It appears the Septuagint just thought, why do we need to repeat it again in the middle of 47 or in the middle of 47, 48? We have at the beginning and at the end. So they just eliminate it one time. So it's not there three times. Genesis 44:4, the story of the silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack, right? Septuagint adds at the end of the verse, "Why have you stolen my silver cup?" Weavers again notes that this question is a necessary bridge for what follows in verse 5, because without this question, a reference to Joseph's sermon to a cup used for divination would have made little sense, because Joseph's brothers at this point in the narrative had no knowledge of it. If you read the narrative, they don't know about it yet, but yet he's making a reference to, "Why have you stolen my silver cup?" So to alleviate that, that they put this question in to kind of alleviate that perceived difficulty. Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint, or Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch called Joseph's sons, two lives. Okay, Septuagint reads, now look at this, 9 lives. All of a sudden, Joseph has 9 sons instead of 2. Well, Septuagint is trying to explain Jacob's statement. You'll remember before he dies, Jacob calls Joseph in, bring your 2 sons. He lays his hands on them. He does this, right? Joseph tried to correct him, right? No. And Jacob says, these 2 sons will be counted as my sons. He adopts Ephraim and Manasseh as his own son, which is why there's no tribe of Joseph, right? There's 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay. And he says to him, any sons you have after this will be counted as yours, but these 2 will be counted as mine. Joseph never has any other sons. But apparently the Septuagint people, or the people behind the text that the Septuagint used, thought that's strange. Why would he mention other sons if he's never going to have any? So they had to give him, guess what? The magic number, 7 more sons. So intentional changes to the text to perceive a logical difficulty. Masoretic text apparently has 3 of these, I think. Samaritan Pentateuch 47, Septuagint 87.
I think this is an observation, and if it needs to end there, great. But it seems as if the scribes have a deep knowledge of the text, almost like maybe better than we do, or at least that I do, that they would make changes of, like, oh, I know this is coming up in the story, so I need to add this thing here. And so while we, like Kurt was talking about, there's some hesitancy to be like, oh, yeah, they're changing the text, but they've got the deep familiarity with the text that they can look to Numbers 9 and make changes
Right.
to Genesis, or they can look ahead a couple chapters and know the story to know that, oh, I need to adjust this here so it doesn't look. I'm assuming that these are like final draft sorts of things and not marginal notes, sort of like
Right.
whatever. So there's a deep familiarity with the text that I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what happened in antiquity was they would memorize large stretches of text. The reason for that is they didn't have these things. If you didn't have it memorized, you got to be my age, you couldn't read it. So you had to memorize it. If you were going to be a scribe, you memorized it. Ezra, we're told, is the scribe of the Torah.
when you read his prayer that he gives after he's told all these people of intermarry, it's just peppered with phrases from the Pentateuch. He knows the thing inside and out. And notice he's a scribe of the Torah. He's not a scribe of the prophets, or he's not a scribe of the Psalms or something like that. Scribes often had a particular set of texts, not the whole thing. So yeah, they would memorize large stretches of text and know them very deeply. Yeah. And when you realize why you know, reading glasses, when you see the Dead Sea Scrolls and see how they're, if you've ever seen them in person, it's tiny, teeny, tiny little text, because all this is terribly expensive. You got to get as much text as you can on a page. Why? You got to make your own ink. You got to find your own papyrus or whatever animal skin that you're writing on. Got to make your own quills. It's time consuming, and therefore it's very expensive, right? And the text is really small. So you get to be my age and it's just unaccessible to you if you don't have reading glasses.
Dr. Stein,
Yeah.
based on the variation from Genesis 2 that you mentioned, lips of Jesus, would you assume that the Pharisees are working from the Septuagint mainly because he's citing?
I would think, I think the Pharisees might have been working with a Hebrew text aligned with the Septuagint at times. Because I think the Septuagint, mainly what you read there, is not an innovation by the translators. It was there in the Hebrew that was in front of them. From all indications from Dead Sea Scrolls and from the alignment of many passages, many secondary readings with the Samaritan Pentateuch, it seems to indicate that for the most part, they're not innovating when they're translating. They might use a translational variant to explain to their audience, but they won't innovate to that great degree. It seems to me.
Okay, so I gotta ask a question. So I have no intention of giving this detail of a presentation ever on variants. It is extremely interesting.
Yeah.
But knowing that there are variants, there are different, you know, the route that the Old Testament scriptures took. I'm gonna play the role of Joe layperson. It says, Pastor, with all of these changes and variants, how can we know what the true word of God is?
Okay, here's the answer. As you've seen, well over 90% of these variants don't make a difference in what the text means. Okay. Number two, with very few exceptions, we can determine what, with a high degree of confidence, what the original text said. Number three, we have an abundance of manuscripts to help us do that. And if you go to classical literature, say the works of Plato, right? For one of the works of Plato, you might have 5 surviving manuscripts to this day. And yet the scholars of Plato think they can figure out what the original text is. We have hundreds, and in some cases in the New Testament, thousands of manuscripts. Okay. If they can do it with 5, we certainly can do it with hundreds.
And so in a sense to trust the scholarship.
Yeah.
God is
Well,
given us the
yeah, it's the old Russian saying that Ronald Reagan was
trust verify.
trust but verify. Trust but verify. Yeah. Trust only to a certain extent because scholars are fallible too.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's kind of a classification of them all. You will see that on unintentional errors, they're all about the same. And with the grammatical corrections, that Samaritan Pentateuch is more than Septuagint, but on the other ones, the Septuagint seems to win the day with secondary readings.
Now, is that just because it's the language switch over? There's
No, because again, I think they're using a Hebrew text. They're just using Hebrew text that was more massaged. than the other ones. Okay, so those percentage, only 6.6 of Masoretic text. It's very reliable. It's not infallible, but it's very reliable. Samaritan Pentateuch, much higher, 31%, about 5 times, almost 5 times. And Septuagint, really out there. It doesn't mean that the Septuagint sometimes won't have a reading that's better than the other two. At times it does. You have to check every variant on its own. Okay, but you can see what the trend is here.
Would maybe a valid or understandable analogy for our lay people be like the various translational opportunities that exist for them today, going from Greek to English, so when you're looking at the percentages going from the Hebrew language to the Greek language, when you see such a high number there, we're sort of already used to the thinking in this, in that we've got some wide variation with regard to translations between
Yeah.
NIV and an ESV, for instance.
Right, yeah. And I think, to be fair to all these traditions, nobody here was, I think, purposely trying to mislead people. They might have been wrong in what they did, but they weren't purposely trying to mislead people,
Until
right?
Yeah, this is like the different trend. What I always tell them, like between the NIV and the ESV, that's a good example. There's always a balance between accuracy, literal accuracy, and readability. It can be highly accurate, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. Or you can make it readable where you still maintain the accurate message.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I define accuracy a little bit differently because to me, if you translate it word for word, but it doesn't mean the right thing in English, that's not accurate. Right? Do not stand in the way of sinners, right? Psalm 1. What's stand in the way of somebody mean in English? It means the wrong thing. It doesn't mean don't block sinners and let them go on with their. It's just a bad translation, even though it matches word by word. For me, accuracy is the meaning matches the meaning.
In looking at languages around the world, a language like English changes over time. For example, the word preach means quite a lot different things to Americans today than it did 60 years ago. It's actually a bad word for them.
In many
Don't
contexts, yeah.
Don't preach at me.
Right.
Is there any of that in the
In Hebrew, in the Bible?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Late biblical Hebrew. You have in the late books like Esther and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, you can see some definite changes. You'll have cohortative forms that are not used with a cohortative meaning, for instance. There are definitely changes that you can see in the language. This is a controversial topic about what actually makes up late biblical Hebrew, but there are some things that are indisputable that you find in late texts that you won't find in earlier texts. So yeah, language changes over time. Always has, because we human beings are such ephemeral creatures. Right. Well, conclusions before we go on to look at something where we can apply this. Masoretic text is the most conservative. It has only a few intentional changes. Most of the changes to Masoretic text were just accidents, Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint show signs much more active scribal alteration for purposes of grammatical correction and harmonization. Septuagint exhibiting a pervasive tendency towards harmonization. The pattern in Genesis of agreement or disagreement in secondary readings reveals that Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint share affinities that mark them as originating in a single textual tradition that's separated early from Masoretic text. So Masoretic text seems to be the most accurate. It has the most things that go back to what Moses originally wrote. Then you had something that split off with some changes. goes up here, and that splits again into Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint.
I'm gonna ask a dense question.
Okay,
What's the comparison point to say that something was a change? Like, what is the Masoretic text being compared to say there's fewer, changes?
well, so the other two. I mean, just taking the three of them together and sussing it out between them. You can see this. And I'm not the first scholar to say this. Frank Moore-Cross from Harvard noted this too. I just did my own work and came to the same conclusion. He did. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about the Septuagint of Genesis. This does not apply to Septuagint of Job or Proverbs or, you might be able to extrapolate it to the rest of the Pentateuch because again, there's appearances that the Pentateuch was done as a whole, as a translation into Greek. But you'd actually have to do this same type of analysis for the other four books of the Pentateuch to make sure. Okay. This does not apply, definitely not apply to Judges or something like that.
So to see if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that in answer to his question, what you've shown us today bears out the hypothesis that there is a text before the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Septuagint, which branched off once, which got us the Masoretic text, and then somewhere along there it branched off again, getting us the Septuagint and the
Right,
Samaritan Pentateuch.
right. Because the Masoretic text does not have all original readings. It's very close, but it's not always right.
Yeah, so it's not that you've proven that this is the case, but it's
The evidence,
likely that
the preponderance of evidence points in that direction. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to prove it for, to 100% certain. The preponderance of the evidence points in that direction. This is all past peer review. So